The morning smelled like cold metal and pine when Claire crested the rise and saw the leaves spill across the highway like a shaken deck of cards. The San Francisco peaks hovered to her left, snow-dusted and indifferent, and the sky above them was a hard, glassy blue that made everything feel sharper than it needed to be. Her dashboard clock insisted on its own small truth, 7:45 a.m., and the courthouse in Flagstaff didn't care about the color of the sky or the sound of her breath. It just cared that at 8 a.m., a judge would bang a gavel and make official the end of 12 years. She drove with the heat barely holding back the chill, fingers worrying the edge of a pendant at her throat. The one piece of her mother's jewelry she'd never learned to take off. The road curved blind around a stand of aspens, the leaves a quick flare of brass, and as the bend opened, she saw it. A tawny spill of fur on the asphalt's shoulder that didn't belong to the season or the road or to anyone's plans. She braked hard, too hard, and the anti-locks chattered, sending a tremor up through her arms. Her coffee sloshed in the cup holder and sent a ribbon of bitter warmth into the air. A pickup coming the other way flashed by with a horn blast that felt personal before it was gone. She pulled over until gravel pinged against the undercarriage, then sat for a heartbeat with the hazard lights clicking a metronome of doubt. The shape on the shoulder lifted its head, and the world narrowed to a set of eyes the color of riverstones, flat and ancient and burning all at once. A bobcat. Full grown. The hindquarters were wrong, one leg tucked beneath the body at a punishing angle. There was dark wetness under the fur that the sun had not yet reached. Breath came from it in a harsh, open-mouthed pant that showed pink and white and the outline of teeth that had done their own share of surviving. Her phone buzzed on the console. Calendar alert, courtroom address, an arrow on the map nudging east as if urgency were a place you could drive to. She glanced at the screen, at the cluster of missed texts from her ex and his lawyer, each one a neat, cornered sentence about parking validation and exhibits and please arrive 10 minutes early. The hazard lights ticked on, off, on. She slid out of the car, and the cold took her across the face like a wet towel. The wind was a small engine through the trees. Somewhere farther off, a raven made a slow syllable and went quiet. Up close, the animal smelled like iron and dust. The bobcat's ears were upright, a crown of black tufts daring the world to explain itself. Claire kept her hands where the cat could see them, though she knew from a book she'd once read that vision was not the first thing a cat trusted. There was no one else around. The pullout was empty, the highway briefly polite. Still, she felt watched, by the peaks, by the raven, by the clock. She crouched, keeping a length of air between them, and saw the gash on the hip clearly now, a parted seam in the fur where the promise of muscle had been interrupted by something hard and fast and stupid. The cat tried to rise and failed, a tremor running through it like a wire pulled tight. The eyes locked onto hers again. She'd seen eyes like that once, years ago in Montana, when she was 10 and still made of wonder, sitting among lodgepoles while her dad tied flies and told her patience was a form of respect. Deer had passed through the trees without rearranging a single needle on the forest floor. She had learned then that wildness could be calm, even when your heart wasn't. A semi rolled past and pushed a shove of wind across the shoulder. The bobcat's whiskers shivered. Claire reached into the back seat through the open driver's door and hauled out the old wool coat she kept for emergencies she had never properly defined. The coat smelled like cedar chips from the closet and last winter. She also dragged forward a small folding crate she'd first bought when Ethan was 9, and they'd tried, briefly, to foster a feral kitten that had taught them both about limits. The crate had been in the trunk ever since, half practical, half superstition, as if owning the tool made her the kind of person who would someday need it. Another car slowed, then sped up again, its driver giving the quick sideways glance people offer when they want to be helpful from a safe distance. A second pickup actually stopped in the lane and idled, window down, the man inside saying something that the wind took and tore apart. She caught only the shape of the warning in his mouth and the way his hand cut the air, as if to draw a hard boundary. He went on, and the road closed behind him like water. She moved the coat forward in increments, letting the bobcat see each small intention. The animal's lips peeled just enough to show the white line of possibility, but it didn't commit to anything. She spoke without words, letting her breath slow, letting her body say it would be dull and predictable. The coat settled across the cat's shoulders like a strange cloud. The muscles there were stone under the fabric, and the heat rising through the wool caught at her wrist. The leg was worse up close. A shallow burn of panic traced her ribs. What she didn't know could hurt them both. But she had hands and a scarf, and sometimes you do what you can reach. She wound the scarf around the haunch, not tight enough to pinch, just enough to give the edges of the wound a name. Her fingers came back streaked and tacky. The bobcat's breath softened a fraction, the way pain sometimes drops into a well to conserve itself. Her phone buzzed again. A new text, more urgent, from the lawyer she'd hired with an exhaustion that had felt like surrender. The courthouse would hear the case without her if she was late enough. The idea should have terrified her. Instead, it rang like a bell in another room. A gust shoved pine scent across the shoulder and threw a hail of leaves under her car. She set the crate's door open and angled it so the interior was a suggestion more than a trap. The bobcat didn't move. There was an understanding here that could not be negotiated. If it chose to go in, it would be because she'd made its world small enough that the dark little room seemed like the safest bad idea. She shifted a fraction closer, slid her hands under the coat so she could feel the quiver in the chest, the spring-loaded bones where the front legs began. The cat's head tilted, whiskers mapping the air around her knuckles. It made a low, contained sound that wasn't a growl so much as a comment. A mile down the highway, a siren started and faded, the noise snagging on the tops of the trees before dying. A thin sheet of high cloud moved in front of the sun, and the cold sharpened. She thought of the judge, of the long, windowless room where she had rehearsed her composure until it felt like a fragile costume. She thought of Ethan's text last night. "Mom, you okay?" And her answering yes. Always yes, because somebody had to be. She gathered the animal the way you gather a decision, carefully, with the parts of yourself that don't shake. The weight surprised her. The bobcat was denser than it looked, an arrangement of muscle and will and the hard lessons of winter. It didn't fight. It didn't trust. It simply endured. And she used the coat like a sling, using her body to become a fence that moved. The crate door received the cat by inches. The foot caught. The claws ticked once against the lip of the carrier. One of them worn down like a nail that had seen too many miles. Then the shoulders passed the threshold. The head followed, and the door clicked shut on a sound that felt like a held breath, finally given permission to leave. For a long second, she stayed there with both hands on the wire, the hazard lights stuttering their orange Morse across the asphalt. In the rear view, the peaks waited with the patience mountains were famous for, and a string of taillights in the far lane stitched red into the morning, as if to remind her time was stitched too. She slid the crate into the back seat, wedged it with the collapsed snow brush and a pair of grocery bags, then stepped back to scan the shoulder for anything she had missed. Blood, fur, an answer. A single raven feather had caught in a tuft of grass. She left it where it was. The engine turned over. Warm air climbed the windshield. Her phone's map rerouted and told her to turn around if she wanted the life she had planned as of last week. Instead, she searched for the wildlife rehab center she'd read about once in a magazine at the dentist's office. Oak Ridge. A green pin bloomed on the screen, a 15-mile line that looked simple because lines always do. She put the car in drive. The Bobcat shifted in the crate behind her, a small rearrangement of pain that felt like a promise. Claire checked her mirrors, eased back onto the highway, and let the courthouse clock keep its own kind of time without her. The call connected on the third ring, the line crackling as if the air itself didn't want to carry her voice. Oak Ridge Wildlife Rescue. What's your emergency? There's a bobcat, injured, just off Highway 180, near mile marker 23, Claire said, glancing toward the tawny body on the shoulder. It's breathing, but its leg... She stopped, eyes catching on the dark stain seeping into the gravel. It's bad. There was a pause. Then the voice came back, calm but weighted. We can send a field unit, but you're looking at least 50 minutes before we can reach you. Are you in a safe location? She looked at her hazard lights winking against the empty stretch of asphalt. Yes, she lied. 50 minutes. She checked the clock on her dash. 7:48 now. In 12 minutes, a gavel would fall in a room she was supposed to be in. Her lawyer's messages stacked in her mind like bricks, each one pressing harder. She could leave. She could drive off and tell herself the animal would survive that long. The bobcat tried to stand then, its shoulders bunching, body lurching halfway upright before collapsing. The sound it made wasn't a growl, wasn't even a hiss. It was something closer to surrender, raw and low, like the sound a rope makes when it frays. A rumble swelled from behind. A blue semi slowed, brakes sighing. The driver's window rolled down, and a man with sunburned cheeks leaned out. "Hey, stay back from that thing. It's dangerous." Claire kept her gaze on the cat. "It's just in pain," she said, her voice steady in a way she didn't feel. The trucker muttered something she didn't catch before pulling away, tires grinding over the shoulder's grit. She crouched, sliding her wool coat from her shoulders. The wind stole her warmth instantly, biting through her blouse. The bobcat's eyes tracked the movement, pupils tightening. She kept her gestures slow, every motion deliberate. The coat came down over its back, swallowing the shivering muscles beneath. Her scarf followed, an old, soft weave she wound carefully around the wounded leg. The fabric soaked crimson almost immediately, but the bleeding seemed to slow. "Easy," she murmured, more for herself than for the cat. She moved to the car, pulling the small folding transport crate from the back seat. Its metal frame clinked against itself, the sound sharp in the cold air. Kneeling beside the cat again, she eased the coat-wrapped body toward the crate. The first attempt failed. The bobcat jerked sideways, claws scraping at the gravel. Pain flared in its eyes, and for a moment she thought it might lash out. But then its head lowered again, breath rasping. She tried once more, lifting from beneath with the coat like a sling. The weight was heavier than she expected, the body tense but not resisting. Inch by inch, she guided it into the crate. When the latch clicked shut, a small exhale left her, white in the air. She rested her hands on the wire for a moment, feeling the heat radiating through the wool. Her phone buzzed, a new message from her lawyer. They're starting without you. Claire looked at the highway stretching ahead toward Flagstaff, then back toward the rescue center in the opposite direction. The choice felt like a clean break in the road itself. She turned the key. The engine caught. The GPS on her phone shifted, recalculating when she typed in Oak Ridge Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. The rote arrow pointed away from the courthouse, away from everything she had told herself she couldn't walk from. She put the car in gear and pulled back onto the road, the crate shifting gently in the back seat with each curve. The Bobcat's eyes met hers once in the rearview mirror, unblinking, holding something she didn't yet understand. And just like that, she left the courthouse clock to tick on without her. Claire reached the long, low building at Oak Ridge just as the light shifted from metallic morning to something thinner and uncertain. The driveway was a rutted ribbon past old ponderosas and chain-link enclosures, the wind chattering through prayer flags of plastic tape that warned visitors to keep back. A hand-painted sign surrendered a faded welcome. Wildlife belongs to the wild. Gravel crackled under her tires. Behind her seat, the crate thudded once, a dull, contained sound that made her slow to a crawl. A woman in a canvas jacket stepped from a side door, phone wedged against her shoulder, hair escaping a messy bun like static. She waved Claire forward without breaking the cadence of her conversation and pointed toward a bay door marked Intake. Claire parked where she was told and cut the engine. The sudden silence made the distant calls of corvids feel immense. When she lifted the crate, the weight pulled against her forearms and sent a clean pain up both tendons. The coat wrapped around the Bobcat's body was damp and dark. She held the crate close as she pushed into cool, fluorescent light that smelled like antiseptic and hay. There were metal tables, a scale on the floor taped in place, a bulletin board bristling with post-its layered like scales. In the near corner, a juvenile hawk blinked from a covered perch, half-moon eyes steady and resigned. A radio murmured somewhere, static, then a voice detailing the location of a hit-and-run fawn along a county road. Dr. Samuel Hayes entered like a weather front. Tall, a shade under lean, the kind of tired that looked baked in. He wore a scrub top under a plaid shirt, sleeves shoved to his elbows, forearms marked with faint lines that might have been history written in cat script. He did not smile. His eyes went first to the crate, then to Claire, as if weighing which one would require more patience. He slid the crate onto the table without touching her hands. "Tell me what you saw." The voice carried no judgment, only habit. Claire gave him the mile marker, the way the animal had tried to stand, the bleeding, the scarf she'd tied. When she mentioned the courthouse and the clock, he didn't react. He was already peeling back the coat with practiced quiet, already setting a hand near the cat's shoulder without quite making contact. "Adult male," he said, to the room more than to her. "Hind limb trauma, likely pelvis involvement, heat loss under control." He nodded toward the woman in canvas, who had reappeared at his side with a clipboard and a small tray of supplies. "Let's get vitals. No names yet. Don't feed. Don't imprint." His eyes flicked to Claire. "We'll keep human interaction minimal. It's not a pet. It can't learn we're safety." The words landed gently and still found their edge. Claire stepped back until the table's cold rail pressed against her hip. She understood the logic, the duty written into it. Still, the Bobcat's breath was a quick flag in its chest, and there was a smear of her scarf thread in the wound like a guilty detail. She wanted to reach out, to tether herself to the moment she'd already complicated by caring. Dr. Hayes snapped open the crate door with the economy of someone who had done this, and survived it 1,000 times. The bobcat's ears flattened, eyes strobing between faces and corners. The woman, Jasmine, the name stitched small on her jacket, angled a towel like she'd been born to it, making a tunnel that persuaded more than forced. With a half lunge, half collapse, the cat was on the table, body quivering like a taut wire. The coat fell open. The injury was a mouth in the hip. Hayes moved in sections. A quiet hand on the scruff, weight through his knees, a quick check along the spine. He murmured numbers, heart rate, respiration, while Jasmine read the tape and wrote. He slid a small catheter with deft speed and the kind of mercy that comes from accuracy. He gave a measured dose of sedative, and the bobcat's breath climbed once, then stepped down the ladder of its own alarm. Most bobcats don't tolerate handling, he said, almost idly, as the body softened under his palm. Avoid eye contact. Avoid voice. They keep more of themselves that way. Claire nodded. She didn't talk. She stood very still and made herself smaller than her need. He irrigated the wound. Blood and road grit and a sliver of something she didn't want to name washed into a pink basin. The sound of the liquid struck metal and flashed her back to the interstate shoulder, to the hard tick of hazard lights and the raven feather snagged in grass. He palpated the leg, jaw set while he listened with his hands. Pelvis fracture, he said, to Jasmine, to the room, to a ledger he carried in his head. Not displaced? Maybe we get lucky. Hip gash needs debridement and stitching, antibiotic, pain control, quarantine in B2. He reached for a small bowl and set it near the cat's mouth. Not quite water, not quite bouillon. A thin, warm broth that rose as steam. He did not offer it directly. He turned his body slightly away like an apology. The cat's nose twitched. A tongue appeared, pink and rough, then retreated, as if the instinct to refuse help was as deep as hunger. Jasmine stepped out to prep the quarantine enclosure. The radio crackled again. Someone asking for a net. Someone else announcing they were en route with an injured raccoon. Claire felt the room fill with life's constant triage, with the math of limited hands and long miles. She took a small plastic cup from a stack without thinking, dipped into the bowl, and held the edge near the bobcat's mouth from a place just outside its radius of fear. She didn't speak. She held, waited. The bobcat lapped once, then twice, the rasp of the tongue against the cup, a delicate noise that felt louder than a siren. A third lap. A fourth. She could feel Dr. Hayes watching, though he didn't move. Most bobcats would never do that, he said, and the words were a simple astonishment. Not praise, not warning, just a small flag planted in the moment. The room blurred. Claire saw her father's hand against a Montana sky, the arc of fly lines stretching like a highway over water. When she was 10, they had sat for hours in lodgepole shade waiting for the afternoon to decide something. Deer had stepped between trees, careful and absurdly alive, and she had learned the shape of quiet then, the way you could leave space between your heartbeat and the world, and in that space, something wild might enter and not feel threatened. Back in the intake bay, Dr. Hayes shifted the bowl closer, reclaiming the care that was his to give. He checked the bandage on the leg she'd wrapped on the roadside, his fingers respectful of the effort even as he redid what needed doing. He stitched, precise and unhurried. He weighed the cat. He logged the numbers that would determine a plan. He never said thank you, and he didn't need to. The work was the thanks. When they slid the bobcat, sedation deep now, breath even, back into a clean crate, the room exhaled in a way she could almost hear. Jasmine returned with a laminated tag, B2, temp ID 23 for Sanfenson. She clipped it to the crate's door. We use numbers until release, she said. No names in quarantine. Claire followed them down a short corridor washed in pale light, past enclosures where life was recalculating itself. A fox tucked into straw like a comma. A pair of owlets rotated to regard her without blinking. A coyote pup asleep with its paw over its nose. They set the crate in B2. Dr. Hayes checked the latch twice and hung a chart on a hook. She lingered at the threshold, fingers curled around the cold frame. In her head, without meaning to, she tried the name on the animal. Not to own him, but to organize her own worry. Riley. It arrived like a smooth stone turned in the pocket, weighty and plain. A temporary map to a thing she could not control. Come back tomorrow if you want an update, Hayes said, already moving to the next need unfolding down the hall. Minimal contact. We'll do what's best for the cat. She nodded once. The word best felt brittle. She stepped out into the thin afternoon and the high smell of pine again. On the passenger seat, her phone sat fat with missed calls and messages like a stack of unopened bills. She didn't pick it up. In the rearview mirror, the building receded and the trees opened their ribs to the sky. Somewhere behind those trees, in a room she had just left, a wild thing slept with stitched skin and a future measured in days and decisions she could only influence, never guarantee. Claire drove away slowly, hunger and relief braided tight, knowing the center of her life had shifted by inches, and that inches mattered more than miles. Winter arrived first as a rumor in the trees, then as a steady fact. 6 months had a way of softening edges and sharpening others, and by the time the aspens lost their last coins of gold, Claire's weekends belonged to Oak Ridge. She learned the rhythm of the place the way you learn a new town, by the smells and the chores, by which door sticks and which latch must be lifted and pushed at the same time. The intake bay lost its strangeness. The corridors stopped echoing. Her hands remembered the sequence before her head did. Scrub, rinse, mix, measure, record. Riley, though a tag on his enclosure still said 23 117, weathered the first weeks behind a curtain of quiet. Healing wasn't a straight line. Some mornings he would be up on his paws, the repaired hip a controlled hinge, breath steady, eyes glassy with endurance. Other days he would sink into the straw like a creature poured into a mold, ribs ticking under fur that had lost its gloss. The stitches along his hip peaked like tiny black knots tied by stubborn fingers, each one a refusal to come undone until it was time. Claire sat with that pattern and taught herself patience that wasn't resignation. She came at dawn, breath puffing white in the air, a thermos of coffee tucked under her arm. The facility smelled like hay, iodine, and the particular feral tang that wasn't the musk of a house cat, but something older, more mineral, as if the animals carried a piece of granite inside them. Dr. Hayes was a constant in her periphery, moving with a farmer's economy, asking for help only when another set of hands was the difference between clean and not. He kept reminders posted on a clipboard outside B2 in block print. Minimal human contact. No direct feeding from hand. Destroy old bedding, rotate scents, encourage natural behavior. She followed every instruction and found room within them to care. The details anchored her. She noted the state of Riley's claws, blunted on the front feet from pacing and from rough substrate, a few worn, uneven like mismatched pencils. She noted the matted swirls on his flanks where winter fur thickened and twisted at the edges of the bandage, how he tolerated a brush only as long as it moved like wind and not like ownership. She watched the sutured skin lose its angry welt pink and return to a color that belonged on an animal. The scar mapped itself into him the way rivers make their own logic on a plain. On storm days, the pines outside combed the wind into a low hum. Once, a wet snow took the power down at sunrise, and the backup generator coughed before catching. In that brief black square of time, the world narrowed to animal breath and the sound of her own heart. She stood at Riley's mesh, fingers curled around the cool wire, counting seconds and reminding herself that she wasn't the only one who had learned to live through outages. When the light returned in a jitter of fluorescence, he lifted his head and blinked as if to say the dark hadn't been a verdict, only a pause. She learned the center's small sciences by doing. She mixed antibiotics, turning amber droplets into measured mercy, drew up syringe lines with the steadiness she'd once reserved for signing settlements and reading affidavits. She recorded weights and body scores and stool consistency in a log that had to stay objective even when her chest was anything but. She hid scent trails in the enclosure, tufts of feather caught on a branch, a small drag of rabbit fur through straw, watched him track with focus that deepened each week. She kept enrichment simple and unsentimental. She did not speak his name aloud, in the quiet evenings, when the wind thinned and the mountains lost their outline. She told him things she hadn't found a way to tell anyone else. Not long monologues, not even full sentences sometimes. Just the shape of truth laid gently into the air like a blanket. The nights she woke at 2 and counted future bills. The glare of her lawyer's emails stacking up after she hadn't shown for the hearing that was rescheduled and then finalized without ceremony, because the paperwork didn't need her to cry to be legal. The way she had scrubbed the last of her ex's cast-iron skillet and left it on the porch with a note that said simply, "It belonged to him." How the house felt bigger now, and also smaller, echoing with her own footsteps and her son's music leaking under his bedroom door when he forgot his headphones. How fear could feel like a live thing and also like a fog, and how she preferred it, on most days, to be something she could see. She didn't ask Riley for answers. She wasn't trying to trade secrets with a wild animal. She spoke because the air in B2 seemed to hold what she said without twisting it, and because Riley did this one thing that no person had managed in months. He blinked slowly. Not tired, not insulted, not bored, deliberate, unhurried, both eyes. The kind of blink that in cats means the world is not currently unacceptable. Each time it happened, something unknotted in her chest, small as a stitch cut with clean scissors. There were setbacks. One afternoon, he caught a hind foot on a branch she'd misjudged as safe. The sound that left him was sharp enough to turn her inside out. She stood frozen long enough for Jasmine to appear at her shoulder and say it was okay without words, just with a hand that hovered near her elbow until her stomach stopped dropping. They adjusted the branch, widened the run, gave him an easier angle. The limp worsened for a day, and then eased back to its new normal. She learned that forward sometimes meant sitting very still and waiting for pain to argue itself quieter. Other animals stitched themselves into her weeks. An owl with a wing like torn paper learned to accept a hood without panic. A fox mended and found his rasping laugh again. A raccoon wore mischief like a backpack and taught every volunteer where the latches were weakest. She found herself belonging to a chorus of caretakers who didn't need to talk much. They carried buckets and bales and the private inventory of their lives and let the work make most of the decisions. Spring offered itself as an idea before it became a fact. The light in the enclosures shifted from pewter to tin to something approaching silver. Riley's coat shed the dullness of winter in uneven patches, little blizzards of hair that stuck to her sleeves and announced her membership in a club she hadn't applied to join. The muscles along his shoulders patterned themselves into ridges meant for motion. He moved with intent more often than with caution. His eyes changed in a way only someone watching would notice. Less glazed with pain, more rimmed with calculation. Dr. Hayes adjusted the regimen the way a careful driver adjusts speed on a road with fresh gravel, slowly, in response to what the tires tell you more than what the sign says. The antibiotics stepped down. The enclosure enrichment stepped up. A hidden pulley sent a piece of scent-marked burlap skittering along the fence line at odd hours. Riley flattened and tracked and pounced with the smooth inevitability of a clock striking. Claire watched from a distance that honored the rules, and also the fact that love, in the wild, has to look like restraint. One evening, as the sun shoved a last coin of light through the pines, she stood by the wire wearing the fatigue of a week thick with depositions and the careful choreography of co-parenting. She held the pendant at her throat, the way you hold a worry stone until its edges memorize you back. Riley turned from the far corner, scenting the air in a motion that involved every whisker. He walked toward her, no hurry, no demand, stopped short of the mesh, and closed both eyes in that long, feline blink that is as much trust as the species offers. The gesture landed like a benediction. She didn't try to name it. She blinked back, slow as a tide. Somewhere a raven coughed a single syllable into the trees. The generator stood quiet. The mountains kept their counsel. And for the first time in months, Claire felt the future as a space she could step into without bracing for impact. The first time it happened, Claire didn't even know there was a camera. It was a Sunday morning in early May, the kind where the sun slipped between the pines like gold water, and the air still held a bite from the night before. She was in Riley's enclosure, crouched by the far corner where a shadow from the fence made a neat square on the ground. The feeding schedule said rabbit quarters, but she had hidden them in 3 separate places to keep him hunting, just like Dr. Hayes had taught her. He had found the first 2 quickly, crunching the bones with that measured, almost thoughtful precision of a predator who wastes nothing. The 3rd piece took longer. He sniffed, doubled back, then caught the scent drifting down from a branch she'd wired in place overhead. He stretched up, claws curling, and leapt with the kind of grace that had been missing all winter. His landing was clean. No limp, no hitch. She found herself laughing softly, not for him, but with him, the way you might when a child finally rides a bike without the wobble. Somewhere outside the chain link, Jasmine stood with her phone angled high, catching the moment against the backdrop of sun and pine. Claire didn't notice until she stepped out of the enclosure and saw the phone lower. Jasmine grinned. "You're a natural," she said, and then slipped away toward the admin office before Claire could answer. By Tuesday, the video was on the center's social media feed. In it, Riley looked like a story in motion. The rise, the leap, the landing, and the slow approach toward Claire, ears relaxed, tail low, taking a strip of meat from the ground while she knelt nearby. The caption read, "Riley's getting stronger every day, thanks to the dedication of volunteers like Claire." The numbers began climbing before lunch. Shares, comments, little red hearts filling the corner of the screen. Someone started a donation thread that doubled the center's monthly goal in less than 48 hours. Local news picked it up for their Good Things Happening segment. Volunteers she barely knew clapped her on the shoulder in the hall, thanking her for what she'd done. But the praise came braided with something sharper. Beneath the flood of encouragement, other voices pooled in the comment sections. Wild animals shouldn't be treated like pets. This is why rehab fails. They get attached to humans. That cat will never survive in the wild now. The first few times she read them, she dismissed the words as noise. But late at night, with the house quiet and Ethan asleep, she found herself scrolling back, rereading, letting the edges cut a little deeper. Was she too close? Did Riley look at her and see something unnatural, something that would make the forest less inviting when the day came to release him? One morning, as she refilled water pans in the quarantine wing, she asked Dr. Hayes without looking up from the hose, "Do you think I'm making it worse? With Riley?" He didn't answer right away. She could hear him behind her, the scrape of a bin sliding across concrete, the shift of hay in a carrier. "You're making it possible for him to have a chance," he said finally. "That's not the same as making it worse." "But the people online—" "They weren't there in November when his hip was open to the bone," Hayes cut in. "They didn't see you here at dawn in January when it was 10 degrees and the power was out. People have opinions. We have the animal. What matters is that when he leaves here, he can feed himself and stay alive. Everything else is just commentary." It should have been enough. She wanted it to be enough. Still, the words from strangers found ways back in, like water through a hairline crack. The center, meanwhile, rode the wave. Donations hit record highs. A corporate sponsor offered to fund a new flight enclosure for raptors. School groups came for tours, their chatter filling the air like a different kind of birdsong. The director asked if she'd be willing to appear in a short profile video about the volunteers. She said no, but her image was already in people's heads, paired with a tawny shape behind mesh and a narrative about compassion. Riley remained indifferent to all of it. He grew leaner, more defined, the scar on his hip fading into the mottled patterns of his coat. His eyes, always that deep stone gray, seemed to watch something beyond the fence line when the wind shifted. She noticed the way he tensed at the sight of a squirrel on the far fence, how he tracked it until it vanished. His muscles coiled differently now, ready in a way they hadn't been for months. One evening, after the last tour group had left and the gravel drive was quiet again, she sat on the bench outside his enclosure. She didn't talk. She just listened to the sound of him moving through the grass, the small rustle of his body against the earth. In the reflection of the mesh, she caught her own outline, still, deliberate, not reaching through. The restraint was its own form of care, she thought. Later, as the sun burned low and the mountains drew their shadows long, Dr. Hayes passed by, his hands in his jacket pockets. "You're thinking about those comments again," he said without looking at her. She almost denied it, then didn't bother. "What if they're right?" He stopped, glanced at Riley, then at her. "Then we'll know in the spring. Until then, stop borrowing trouble. The cat doesn't care what they think. He cares if he can run, hunt, and heal. And right now, he can." She nodded, the pendant at her throat warm from her hand. In the fading light, Riley lifted his head, ears pivoting toward something she couldn't hear. He blinked once, slow, then turned back to his watch. Claire stayed until the shadows swallowed the last of the gold between the trees, letting the quiet answer questions she couldn't. The pain arrived as an inconvenience at first, a small, mean stitch under Claire's ribs that she blamed on missed meals and too much coffee. It showed up in the late afternoons when the light went thin and the center grew quiet, when she bent to lift a feed bin or reached to latch a gate and felt something tug sharply inside, as if a wire had snagged. She shrugged it off. She drank water. She told herself the body complains when it's been carrying you through a winter like the last one. By June, The stitch had become a shadow that didn't leave, and food began to taste like memory more than like anything present. Weight slipped away without asking permission. She tightened her belt and threw on a heavier jacket over her t-shirts and pretended it was about the morning chill. In the mirror, the corners of her eyes sharpened and her collarbones declared themselves, and she pretended not to notice either. Her doctor's office smelled like lemon disinfectant and the paper of old magazines baked on a windowsill. Tests replaced guesses. Scans replaced hope that this was merely stress in a costume. The waiting room clock counted only forward. In the consult room, a screen lit with her insides in gray and white and a constellation of wrongness that no one could reframe. The word came out of the physician's mouth with a professional gentleness that refused drama. Pancreatic. It hung there without ornaments because it didn't need any. The plan was laid out with boxes and arrows. Immediate chemotherapy. Aggressive. A grid of weeks and infusions and a list of side effects that read like a slow erasure. Nausea, fatigue, pain, more pain. The possibility of a little more time measured in months that would be spent in rooms exactly like this one, negotiating the terms of each day. She listened. She nodded at intervals that represented comprehension. When the doctor paused and asked if she had questions, she thought of practical things like scheduling and work and the smell of antiseptic at dawn. She thought of people she hadn't called in a year and of the way Ethan's sneakers lived in a heap by the front door. She thought of Riley's slow blink in the evening light and the shape his body made when he tested the fence line, as if mapping a future beyond it. Then she said she needed a few days to decide. At home, she opened the windows to let the pine come in and watched dust chase itself in sunbeams. The ordinary beauty of a house that had once held more laughter and still, somehow, held enough. Ethan was 15, taller than her now, clumsy about it sometimes, knocking his hip into the counter, leaving milk cartons an inch open in the fridge as if the air itself could finish the job. He did not ask many questions. He had learned to watch her without weighing her down, a skill that made her both grateful and a little heartbroken. That evening, she told him the truth, without trying to knit it into something softer. He stood with his hands on the back of a chair, like a man twice his age, eyes steady and wet and furious in a way that refused to find words. She wanted to promise him something she could deliver. She could not. She gave him the only honest thing she had left, that she would be with him in every way she could be, every day she had, and that there would be no surprises he had to face alone. He nodded once. Later, she heard him in his room, music too loud for a minute, then silent. She leaned her forehead against his door and did not push it open. The next morning, she drove to Oak Ridge in the new light that always makes yesterday's news feel like a rumor. The center met her with the same chores it offered every day. Water to be changed, charts to update, calls to return, a coyote pup to weigh and complain about it, a tangle of hose to unkink. Routine has its own mercy. She accepted it gratefully and let her body do what it knew. Dr. Hayes noticed without asking. He had a talent for that. He watched her too long at the sink, watched the way she rubbed her sternum without thinking, watched her pause between enclosures to breathe as if the air were thicker than it should be. When he finally asked if she had news, she said yes in a voice that already knew how to carry the weight quietly. He nodded once and did not pry. He adjusted her tasks for the day like a man moving a chair so someone could rest without making a scene of it. Chemotherapy waited like a road under construction, all detours and delays and the possibility that you might never arrive where you were trying to go. She put the protocol next to her calendar and weighed it. The days left would be spent in fluorescent light, inside a smell that never washed out, chasing a length of time that would never feel like a bargain struck in good faith. Or they could be spent at dawn and dusk under pine and raven, in the company of a boy who still needed rides to school and reminders to wash the cereal bowl and a wild cat who was learning to leave. She chose the latter. Not because she was brave, because the math made sense only if life could still look like itself on the way out. She told the doctor. The physician tried again, because that is the job, laying out curves and percentages and a hitch of hope that, if not realistic, might still help someone sleep. Claire appreciated the persistent kindness and closed the door gently on the way out. She told Ethan in the language they now shared, direct, no hedging. They would plan. They would make the most of the summer. They would sit on the porch and let dusk do its work. They would go see his favorite trail at the peaks and drop stones from the footbridge into the creek and argue about whether burritos should have rice in them. He nodded, then asked if he could drive more often. She laughed and said yes and meant it. At the center, the days gathered themselves into acts of attention. She took the early shifts to help Jasmine with the raptors before the heat built, then slipped to B2 and stood where she always stood, far enough to be respectful, close enough to feel the presence of what she had midwifed back toward the world. Riley had filled out, shoulders roped, hips moving cleanly. The scar a pale ribbon you could miss if you didn't go looking. He stalked the moving burlap in the pulley line with a patience that was pure salvation to watch. He ran the length of the enclosure in a blur, stopped, pivoted, ran again, and did not limp. He was almost ready. One afternoon, the wind slacked and the generator clicked once in the background, a ghost of a machine waiting to be needed. Claire set her palm against the cool mesh of Riley's enclosure, the wire imprinting faint diamonds into her skin. He turned toward her from the shade and weighed her with that old river-stone gaze, unblinking, unafraid, every inch of him speaking fluent wilderness again. She didn't try his name. She didn't try any language at all. She let the fact of him fill the space between them until there was room for only what mattered. We're both racing against time, she whispered, almost without sound, as if saying it louder would make the clock greedy. The words vanished into the straw and the dust and the warm smell of animal, and she felt no need to fetch them back. The race was not against each other. It was alongside parallel lanes, two bodies moving toward what they were always going to meet. After that, the choices simplified. She canceled the meetings that could be canceled and shortened the ones that couldn't. She said yes to every text from Ethan that sounded even remotely like an invitation. She started a small file for him labeled Things to Know and put in it only the practical. How to refinance the old car when it finally gave up, which plumber answered on weekends. The recipe for the chili he pretended not to like, but always ate 2 bowls of. She told Dr. Hayes when her energy dipped and let him assign her to tasks that let her sit without advertising that she needed to. The center kept breathing. Animals came in broken and left less so or didn't leave at all. Volunteers rotated through with their private battles tucked into their pockets. The mountains kept their blue line of certainty on the horizon. In that steady frame, Claire found her footing and decided that if time was a finite river, she would stand where it touched what she loved most and let it pass over her with intention. Riley slept in the straw, one paw over his nose, and woke to the sound of the pulley running a lure along the fence line. Ethan texted a photo of a sunset from the skate park and wrote nothing beneath it because nothing was required. She wrote back a heart and then put the phone away and watched the cat stretch into a run that looked like forever. By late August, Riley was no longer the fragile shadow she'd first lifted from the roadside. His muscles coiled like braided rope under his coat, the faint scar on his hip now just a pale seam in the tawny pattern. The days were still hot, but the evenings cooled fast, and Claire could feel the first lean edge of autumn in the breeze that slid down from the San Francisco peaks. The enclosure could barely contain his energy now. He paced in measured lines, not from anxiety, but from instinct, a predator charting the limits of his territory. His ears flicked at every sound, nose testing the currents for messages from beyond the fence. When she brought enrichment, a scented burlap scrap dragged along the ground, a feather bundle hung from a branch. He stalked and pounced with surgical precision. No wasted movement, no sign of the limp that had once defined him. One evening, she came after closing hours, when the tourists and school groups were gone, and the center had settled into its quieter breathing. The sky was a spill of violet and ember at the horizon, shadows from the pines stretching long across the gravel. She stood at the edge of the enclosure, watching Riley perched on the highest crossbeam of his climbing frame, body still, gaze fixed toward the peaks. It struck her. He looked exactly like a cat answering some private call, something older than the fence, older than her care, older than the injury that had tethered him to this place. The sight cracked her in a way she'd been expecting, but had hoped to delay. "You see it too, don't you?" she murmured, though her voice didn't carry far enough for him to hear. Behind her, footsteps scraped the gravel. Dr. Hayes joined her at the fence, hands deep in his jacket pockets, eyes tracking Riley's silhouette against the fading light. "He's ready," he said quietly. The words felt heavier than they should have, as if they carried not just the weight of a decision, but the end of an entire season of her life. "Already?" Hayes glanced at her. His hunting drive is sharp, his endurance is back, and his hips healed as well as it ever will. If we keep him much longer, we risk dulling the instincts he needs most. Spring release is best for the young ones. For him. He paused, watching Riley drop soundlessly to the ground. The sooner, the better. She nodded, but her throat tightened. And what if he doesn't make it out there? Hayes's voice stayed even. Then at least we know we gave him the chance. That's all we can do. Keeping him here isn't saving him. It's keeping him. The truth of it hurt more than the thought of letting go. She wrapped her hand around the pendant at her neck, the smooth silver warm from her skin. It had belonged to her mother, a piece she'd kept through moves, through the divorce, through every storm that threatened to strip her down. She squeezed it now, as if the metal could anchor her to the moment. That night, she lay awake long after Ethan's door had gone quiet, her mind replaying the sight of Riley balanced on the beam, the mountains calling him wordlessly. She thought about the choices she had left, how many were about holding on, and how many were about knowing when to release. The next few weeks, she found herself studying him differently, not just for signs of physical readiness, but for that intangible wildness. The way his ears would pivot to track something she couldn't hear. The way he froze before a pounce, his tail twitching in slow concentration. When the scent lure raced along the pulley line, he no longer lunged immediately. He waited, calculated, then struck with such speed that she lost him in the blur between start and finish. One morning she caught him crouched at the fence's edge, eyes locked on a mule deer grazing just beyond the outer barrier. Neither moved for nearly a minute, predator and prey sharing a suspended silence. Then the deer twitched its ear and drifted off, and Riley turned back to his enclosure as if remembering where he was. Claire felt the ache of pride and loss at once. She was watching him grow into something she could no longer keep, and the paradox was that it meant she had done her job well. On an unusually crisp evening in early September, she lingered by the fence until the shadows erased the edges of the enclosure. Riley approached, slow but deliberate, until they stood a foot apart, the wire between them. He blinked once, then twice. Unhurried, deliberate. The same gesture he'd given her in those early, fragile weeks. She returned it, her own eyelids lowering like a curtain on a scene she wasn't ready to end. "When spring comes, we'll have to release him," Hayes had said. But Claire knew the season might come sooner, and with it, the moment when she'd have to unclench her hands and let the wild have back what was never hers to keep. She reached for the pendant again, her thumb finding the groove in the metal, and decided she would not count the days until release. Instead, she would meet each one as it came, knowing that every step he took toward the fence line was another step toward the life waiting beyond it, no matter how much of her heart he took with him when he finally crossed over. The release day came on the first truly clear morning of spring, the kind where the air felt rinsed and the light had a sharpness that made every edge seem newly cut. The snow line had retreated far up the San Francisco peaks, leaving the lower slopes patched with green and gold. Claire stood beside the transport crate in the back of the center's truck, her hand resting lightly on the wire door. Riley's eyes blinked slow in the filtered light, his ears tilting toward every sound: a jay's call, the crunch of boots on gravel, the low hum of the truck's engine cooling after the drive. Dr. Hayes had chosen the release site with the care of someone matching a lock to a key. It was a stretch of forest 15 miles from town, thick with ponderosa and pinon, crisscrossed by game trails and split by a narrow creek that ran even in dry months. No roads cut too close. No houses sat within miles. The land smelled of sun-warmed needles and distant snowmelt, and the only human mark was a faded Forest Service boundary post, leaning slightly in the wind. Claire and Hayes carried the crate together, setting it down on a bed of pine duff a few feet from the creek bank. The ground was soft underfoot, the hush broken only by water moving over stone. A GPS tracker, lightweight, hidden in the fold of Riley's scruff, would give them a window into his next weeks, a way to know if the wild had welcomed him back. For a moment, neither of them moved. Riley crouched inside, his muscles coiled but not tense, nose pressed to the crate door's mesh. Claire thought she could almost see the scents rolling toward him, painting a picture she could never fully grasp: the tang of deer trail, the musk of old scat, the mineral breath of the creek. Hayes broke the stillness. "When you open it, step back. Give him a clear path." She nodded, her fingers finding the latch. She hesitated, not because she doubted the choice, but because her chest felt too small for the air it needed to hold. This was what she had worked for since that November morning, through snow and frost and quiet evenings watching him relearn the art of being himself. And yet, it felt like pushing a loved one toward a train she could not board. The latch clicked, the sound small but final. She pulled the door wide and stepped back onto the pine's soft ground. Riley stayed where he was for 3 heartbeats, his head swiveling between the open forest and the humans standing still behind him. Then, with a single low step, he crossed the threshold. His paws sank into pine needles, claws flexing, tail low. He moved without hurry, placing each foot as though testing the ground's memory. The sunlight caught the pale seam of his healed hip, then slid off into shadow. Halfway to the tree line, he stopped. Claire didn't breathe. Riley turned his head. Not fully, just enough that she could see the profile of his face, the glint of his eye. It wasn't a plea or a question. It was acknowledgement. Then he moved again, slipping into the undergrowth with the silence of something born to vanish. The shadows took him in increments. First his tail, then his shoulders, and finally the curve of his ears, until the forest was whole again. No sign of the crate or the months between. Claire's hand stayed on the pendant at her throat. The metal felt cool, as if it had absorbed the morning air instead of the warmth of her skin. Hayes didn't speak. They stood a while longer, listening to the sounds of the place return. A woodpecker's knock, the rush of the creek, the faint chatter of unseen birds. "Tracker's live," Hayes said at last, glancing at the small receiver in his hand. A green light pulsed every few seconds. "We'll know if he settles in." They carried the empty crate back to the truck. Its weight was strangely lighter now, not just from the absence of the animal, but from the knowledge that it had done its job. On the drive back, Claire watched the forest slip by, trunks in straight lines, the occasional flare of wildflowers in the ditch, a hawk circling so high it was only a suggestion against the blue. She thought about how easily Riley had disappeared into that pattern, how perfectly he belonged to it. The ache in her chest was real, but so was the quiet satisfaction beneath it. At the center, she helped rinse the crate, the scent of pine still clinging to its metal. Hayes stored it away, ready for the next animal whose story would run the same arc. Rescue, recovery, release. The cycle was bigger than any one person, but in this case, she had been part of it from the first mile marker to the last shadow in the trees. That evening, she sat on her porch with a mug of tea, the air cooling as the sun dropped. Ethan came out, his phone in hand, and showed her the tracker's latest ping, Riley's signal, a few hundred yards from the creek, right where they'd left him. She smiled, not at the reassurance of his location, but at the image it summoned. A cat crouched in the half-light, ears turning toward the sounds of a life he'd been waiting to return to. She sipped her tea, watching the mountains darken, and let herself feel both the loss and the relief. Riley was where he belonged, and that meant, in some quiet way, so was she. By late summer, the world had shrunk to the walls of her home and the slow clock of her own body. Claire's energy slipped away in thin layers. First the mornings she used to spend at the center, then the afternoons with Ethan in the kitchen, and finally the short walks to the mailbox. Hospice brought its own rhythm. Nurses with calm voices, the quiet arrival of equipment, the scent of antiseptic mixing with the pine that drifted in through open windows. She tried to keep her bedroom light-filled, the curtains always drawn back to show the trees. On good days, she could sit propped against pillows and watch the branches sway, catching flashes of jays and the occasional hawk tracing circles above. On harder days, the ceiling became her horizon. The GPS tracker updates on Riley had slowed. Most of the time, Hayes only sent a simple line. He's moving, he's hunting. Occasionally, a small map with a green dot deep in the forest, far from roads and houses. She liked to imagine him there, moving silently under the canopy, his paws finding the same quiet trails she'd once seen him pace in his enclosure. Then, one early September morning, the green dot appeared much closer to town. Hayes called before she could even open the map. "He's near the outskirts," he said. "Could be passing through, but I thought you'd want to know." She didn't have to ask what he was offering. That afternoon, Hayes and Ethan arrived together. Ethan carried the same folding transport crate she'd once used to carry Riley to Oak Ridge, its metal washed clean but still smelling faintly of cedar chips. Hayes explained that they'd spotted him near a drainage ditch, sedated him lightly for transport, just enough to keep him calm for the short trip. The sound of claws shifting against metal came first, a low scrape that made her chest tighten. Then Hayes stepped into the room, the crate in his hands. Inside, Riley crouched, eyes half-lidded but still alert, ears flicking toward her voice when she said his name without thinking. They set the crate on the floor beside her bed. She leaned forward slowly, her hands curling around the wire. Riley's gaze locked onto hers, and in that stillness, the months between them seemed to dissolve. She saw the same deep river-stone eyes from that morning on Highway 180, the same unblinking presence that had stopped her from driving away. Hayes unlatched the door just enough for her to slip a hand through. Riley didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped forward until his forehead pressed gently into her palm, the weight of it warm and grounding. His eyes closed, a slow, complete surrender to the moment. She let her fingers trace the line of his cheek, the soft edge of his ear, feeling the steady life beneath the fur. Ethan knelt beside her, watching silently. She knew he understood this was a gift, a final crossing of paths that would not come again. Hayes stood a few feet back, giving them space. For a long while, no one spoke. The room filled with the small sounds of breathing, the slow in, the slow out, and the distant rustle of leaves outside the window. Claire's throat ached, but she found the words she needed. "Go home, Riley," she whispered. "You've still got places to see." It wasn't a goodbye in the way people say it to each other. It was permission, plain and simple. When Hayes finally lifted the crate, Riley stepped back inside without fuss, the sedative making his movements fluid and quiet. They carried him out, and she heard the truck door close, the engine start. Then the sound faded down the road, until the only noise left was the wind in the trees. Ethan stayed with her the rest of the afternoon. They didn't talk much, just sat together while the light shifted across the floor. Every so often, she caught him glancing at her, the same way she used to glance at him when he was small and sleeping in the back seat after a long day. That night, she dreamed of pine needles under her hands and the smell of cold water on stone. In the dream, Riley moved ahead of her along a narrow trail, never looking back, but never disappearing entirely, always just far enough to keep her following. When she woke, the dream clung to her like the memory of a place she'd once lived and might find again. And for the first time in weeks, she felt no fear about where the trail might lead. A few weeks later, Claire slipped away in her sleep. It was early morning when the hospice nurse found her, the light just beginning to touch the tops of the pines outside her bedroom window. Her face was calm, her hands resting loosely over the quilt Ethan had pulled up for her the night before. There was no sign of struggle, only the stillness of someone who had reached the end of a long road and decided, without ceremony, to stop walking. News traveled quickly through the small network that had grown around her over the past year. The volunteers at Oak Ridge heard first from Dr. Hayes, who stood in the break room with a mug of coffee going cold in his hand. "She's gone," he said simply. No one asked who he meant. They all knew. For the rest of the day, the center moved a little more quietly. The sound of broom bristles against the concrete was sharper, the clang of food pans softer. Jasmine posted a small photo on the staff bulletin board. Claire, in her worn wool coat, crouched just outside Riley's enclosure, her head turned toward him as if listening. Someone taped a scrap of paper beneath it with 4 words, She made the time count. Hayes decided to share Claire's story publicly. The center's social media posted a long thread. Photos of Riley from the day he arrived, through his recovery, to his release in the forest. Between them, paragraphs told the truth. How she'd stopped on the side of the highway on her way to a court hearing. How she'd chosen the animal over her own schedule. How she'd shown up in every season until he could survive without her. They didn't hide the fact that she had been sick at the end, or that she'd kept working with the animals anyway. The post went viral in a way that surprised even the staff. Donations poured in, not just money, but offers of supplies, volunteer hours, and letters from strangers who said the story had reminded them to stop and help when they might otherwise have driven past. Within a month, the center launched its largest fundraising campaign ever, naming it the Claire Thompson Wildlife Fund. Its mission was simple: to save as many injured wild animals as possible, no matter how inconvenient the timing. Ethan came to the center for the dedication ceremony. He stood at the edge of the crowd, hands in his jacket pockets, listening as Hayes spoke. Claire didn't see wild animals as problems to avoid. She saw them as lives in motion, worth the effort to keep moving. Riley was just one of many who will get that chance because of her. Afterward, Ethan walked the familiar path to the enclosures. The air smelled the same: pine, hay, and the faint musk of fox and bobcat. He paused at B2, now housing a young lynx with a bandaged foreleg. For a moment, he saw the ghost of a tawny coat and riverstone eyes watching him from the corner. That summer, he started coming in once a week to help. At first, it was small tasks, refilling water bowls, cleaning enclosures, but soon he learned the routines: hiding food to encourage hunting behavior, logging weights, watching for signs of stress. Hayes treated him like any other volunteer, though sometimes Ethan caught the older man looking at him with a softness that wasn't part of his usual reserve. In quiet moments, Ethan found himself repeating some of his mother's habits. He stood still near the mesh, letting the animals approach or not. He kept his voice low, and once, when the lynx blinked slowly at him, he blinked back without even thinking about it. Months later, on a cold morning when the first snow had dusted the peaks, Ethan asked Hayes if they'd heard anything from Riley's tracker. Hayes smiled faintly and tapped a folded map on his desk. Last ping was 2 weeks ago, deep in the forest, right where he ought to be. Ethan imagined him there, moving through shadow and light, his paws silent over the snow. He thought about how his mother had once said that sometimes saving a life didn't just save them, it saved you too. Standing in that small, warm office, he understood what she'd meant. The forest would keep its secrets. Riley would keep moving. And so would Ethan, carrying forward the work she'd begun. Each step another way of saying she was still here, in the pine-scented air and the lives that were given back to the wild.